The candles flickered across her face as she spoke the words that would systematically dismantle 15 years of shared history. I observed, with an almost clinical detachment, how the flame's dance created shadows that seemed to fracture her features, an apt metaphor for how my perception of her was splintering in real time. "I've been seeing Richard," she said, her voice steady in a way that suggested rehearsal. "Richard. My vice president. My right hand in building Meridian Technologies from a startup to a Fortune 500 company. The man who had stood beside me at company milestones, family gatherings, countless strategy sessions." I found myself analyzing the choice of restaurant, Le Petit Jardin, where we'd celebrated our engagement 13 years ago. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, one life-changing conversation at the beginning, another at what I now recognized as the end. The $300 bottle of Bordeaux I'd ordered minutes earlier sat unopened, a dark sentinel to this unfolding catastrophe. My immediate physiological responses registered like data points on an internal monitor: elevated heart rate, constricted throat, a curious numbness in my fingertips. The professional in me, the CEO who had navigated countless crises, began automatically cataloging details: the slight tremor in her left hand as she reached for her water glass, the way she'd positioned herself slightly back in her chair, a subconscious retreat. "How long?" The question emerged with remarkable composure, as if I were inquiring about quarterly projections. 8 months. Her response was immediate. "Prepared." I did the mental calculation: it would have started around the time of the Chicago expansion, when Richard and I were putting in 18-hour days. The irony of my absence enabling their proximity didn't escape me. The maitre d' approached with our appetizers, butter-poached lobster that suddenly seemed absurd in its elegance. I watched him arrange the plates with practiced precision, noting how the routine of fine dining continued uninterrupted while my personal infrastructure collapsed. "I didn't plan for this to happen," she continued after he left, her words following a script I'd heard in countless movies but never expected to experience firsthand. "It just evolved. Evolved. Like a virus adapting to its host environment." I found myself mentally retracing months of interactions, board meetings, dinner parties, reconstructing a timeline of deception with the same thoroughness I'd apply to auditing company financials. Every casual touch, every inside joke between them, every late-night strategy session took on new significance. The restaurant's ambient noise faded to a dull hum as my mind began constructing response scenarios with algorithmic precision. I could see the branching pathways of possible reactions, each with its own set of consequences and emotional costs. The hurt was there, a massive wave building somewhere in my consciousness, but for now, analytical clarity prevailed. "Are you in love with him?" The question wasn't born of emotion but of data gathering. Understanding the depth of the betrayal would be crucial for what would come next. Her hesitation told me everything. "I think I am," she whispered, and I watched a tear trace down her cheek with the same detachment one might observe rain on a window. The lobster grew cold between us as I sat in silence, my mind already beginning to formulate the architecture of response. Years of corporate strategy had taught me that the most devastating counterstrikes are those planned with precision rather than passion. As she spoke of guilt and confusion, of unmet needs and unintended consequences, I found myself noting each word not for their emotional weight but for their future utility. By the time the maitre d' returned to inquire about our untouched appetizers, I had already begun mapping out the sequence of events that would follow this evening. The hurt would come later, I knew, but for now, I was grateful for the analytical shield my professional life had built, the ability to process catastrophic data while maintaining operational functionality. "We should go home," I said finally, interrupting what had become a monologue of justification. "We have a lot to discuss." The calm in my voice surprised even me, but then, the best strategic advantages often come from appearing less prepared than you are. As I signaled for the check, I caught our reflection in the restaurant's window, a successful couple celebrating their anniversary, indistinguishable from any other dining pair in the room. The perfect facade, now revealed as meticulously maintained fiction. I wondered, with academic curiosity, how many other seemingly perfect tableaus around us held similar fault lines, invisible until the moment of catastrophic fracture. The drive home became an exercise in compartmentalization. Each traffic light offered a moment to categorize and file away fragments of the evening's revelation. Red light, 8 months of deception. Yellow light, the subtle shifts in Richard's comportment during board meetings. Green light, the growing frequency of her yoga classes on Tuesday evenings. I maintained a precise 3 car lengths behind the vehicle ahead, channeling my focus into mechanical operations while my mind constructed a temporal map of their betrayal. The methodical process was familiar. It was how I built Meridian, breaking down complex problems into manageable variables. She sat beside me in calculated silence, her hands folded in her lap like a passenger on a commuter train rather than a woman who had just demolished a decade and a half of shared history. The wedding ring on her left hand caught the intermittent glare of passing streetlights. I found myself analyzing its symbolism with academic detachment, a platinum band with an embedded diamond, chosen for its structural integrity and timeless design. The irony wasn't lost on me. Our house materialized through the darkness, 6,000 square feet of carefully curated success. As I pulled into the circular driveway, my CEO's mind automatically assessed it as an asset to be leveraged, current market value approximately $2.8 million, mortgage nearly paid off, appreciation rate steady at 4% annually. These concrete data points provided anchor amid the emotional turbulence. "We should talk," she said as we entered the foyer, her voice carrying the forced steadiness of someone crossing a frozen lake. Indeed. I moved to my home office, neutral territory, equipped with the tools of analysis I'd need. The leather chair behind my desk offered familiar comfort, its worn armrests bearing the imprints of countless strategic decisions. She took the seat across from me, and for a moment, the setting transformed our impending conversation into something resembling a performance review. "I need you to understand," she began, but I raised my hand. A gesture I'd used countless times to halt premature explanations and boardroom discussions. "First, I need data points," I said, opening my laptop. "When exactly did it start? I want dates, locations, frequency of contact." My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to document each detail with the same precision I'd apply to a corporate audit. Her expression flickered between surprise and something approaching relief. Perhaps she'd expected explosive anger rather than systematic inquiry. "Does it really matter exactly when?" "Everything matters," I interrupted, my voice maintaining its professional cadence. "Context is crucial for accurate analysis." In truth, each detail was a sword being forged for future use, but the process of gathering them helped dam the flood of emotions threatening my composure. She began to speak, and I typed, creating a timeline of destruction. Chicago conference, first intimate contact. Company Christmas party, coded glances across the room. Late strategy sessions that evolved into hotel meetings. Each disclosure was a data point, each location a coordinate plotting the map of their betrayal. "You're processing this like a business problem," she observed after 20 minutes, her voice carrying a note of frustration. I looked up from my screen. "How else would you suggest I process the simultaneous destruction of my marriage and the compromise of my company's executive integrity?" The question hung between us, rhetorical yet laden with the first hints of the anger I'd been sublimating into analysis. I watched her flinch, noting the reaction with the same detachment I'd used to observe a competitor's response to a hostile takeover bid. "I never meant for this to affect the company," she said, missing the point so completely that I almost laughed. "Everything affects the company," I replied, closing my laptop with deliberate care. "Every personal failure, every breach of trust, every miscalculation in judgment creates ripples that impact operational integrity." Richard understood this. It's why I trusted him with expansion strategies, market analyses, and apparently, by extension, my wife. The analytical shield cracked slightly on the last words, allowing a burst of bitter emotion to seep through. I watched her react to it, cataloging her micro-expressions, guilt, defiance, a flash of what might have been regret. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small in the wood-paneled office. I stood, moving to the window that overlooked our carefully landscaped backyard. In the darkness, I could make out the outline of the garden she'd spent 3 years perfecting. Another asset to be evaluated, another variable in the equation of dissolution. Now, I said, my reflection in the window glass appearing eerily composed, we begin the process of systematic deconstruction. Of everything. The words emerged not as a threat but as a project scope statement, delivered with the same professional detachment I'd used to outline a corporate restructuring. In my mind, flowcharts were already forming: asset division, legal consultations, strategic corporate reorganization. Each branch of the decision tree led to carefully calculated consequences. "You're thinking about revenge," she said, reading something in my posture. "I'm thinking about appropriate response protocols to a breach of fiduciary and personal trust," I corrected, turning back to face her. "Revenge implies emotional motivation. This will be entirely strategic." As she left the office, I remained at the window, watching her reflection fade from the glass. In its place, I began mentally projecting spreadsheets, timelines, and action items. The hurt would come, I could feel it building like pressure in a sealed system, but for now, the familiar patterns of strategic planning provided a framework for navigating the chaos. I reached for my phone, opened a new note, and began to type: project parameters, personal and professional restructuring, phase 1. The cursor blinked expectantly, ready to receive the first steps of what would become an exhaustively detailed plan for systematic response to catastrophic betrayal. Midnight arrived with the sterilizing clarity of fluorescent lights in an operating theater. I sat in my office, surrounded by the digital architecture of our shared life, each monitor displaying a different aspect of the dissolution protocol I'd spent the last several hours constructing. The house breathed around me with familiar settling sounds, while upstairs, in what had been our bedroom, she slept, or perhaps lay awake, contemplating the scaffolding of lies now exposed to oxygen and light. The execution phase began with methodical precision. Each keystroke represented another severance point, another strategic incision into the tissue of our intertwined lives. First, the joint accounts. I'd always maintained separate banking relationships, a habit born from early startup days when cash flow demanded rigorous compartmentalization. Now, that professional paranoia proved prescient. Wire transfers moved with silent efficiency across digital networks. I watched the numbers shift, each transaction log a clinical record of dismantling. Corporate accounts remained untouched. This phase focused solely on personal assets, though my mind had already mapped the coming corporate restructuring with the same analytical thoroughness. Executing financial triage, I murmured to myself, documenting each step in a spreadsheet with timestamps and confirmation numbers. The process felt familiar, reminiscent of late nights orchestrating complex market maneuvers. Only this time, the target wasn't a competitor's market share, but the fundamental infrastructure of my personal life. 2:17 a.m., primary joint account closure initiated. 2:23 a.m., investment portfolio access protocols modified. 2:35 a.m., property management notifications queued for morning delivery. Each action generated its own digital echo, a breadcrumb trail of systematic decoupling. I found myself analyzing my own efficiency with detached curiosity, noting how the familiar patterns of strategic execution provided a buffer against the emotional undertow threatening at the edges of consciousness. A notification lit up my phone: Richard, sending a late-night email about tomorrow's board meeting. The timestamp suggested insomnia, perhaps guilt manifesting in professional overcompensation. I added the data point to my growing psychological profile of his behavior patterns, another variable in the complex equation of response. The email itself was perfectly crafted, maintaining the fiction of normalcy with practiced corporate fluency. I studied his word choices, looking for subtextual tells, slightly more formal than usual, an excess of qualifying statements. Fear, poorly masked by professional jargon. He knew the revelation would come, was already preparing his defensive positio. Ning. I opened our corporate org chart, studying it with new eyes. Each connecting line represented not just hierarchical structure but potential pressure points, leverage nodes in the coming reorganization. Richard's position, so carefully cultivated over years, now resembled a house of cards, each support point a potential failure node once strategic pressure was applied. Processing betrayal through systematic response, I typed into my personal log, the keyboard clicks echoing in the quiet house. Emotional impact managed through structured action protocols. 3:45 a.m., documentation of affair timeline completed, cross-referenced with corporate events and travel records. The pattern emerged with mathematical clarity, each interaction plotted like data points on a graph, revealing the elegant geometry of deception. A sound from upstairs, footsteps, hesitant. She was awake, perhaps contemplating coming down to continue our discussion. I watched the security camera feed on one of my monitors as she paused at the top of the stairs, then retreated. The moment registered as both personal wound and tactical advantage. Her uncertainty would facilitate the next phase of systematic response. I returned to my task list, each item a small victory over emotional chaos. Legal consultation scheduled for 7:30 a.m. Corporate counsel briefing prepared. Asset inventory completed. Digital access protocols revised. Evidence documentation structured and encrypted. The night deepened around me as I worked, the darkness outside my window a canvas for projecting future scenarios. Each potential response from them generated its own decision tree, each possible reaction cataloged and countered in advance. The process was almost beautiful in its complexity, human emotion reduced to game theory and strategic calculation. By 4:30 a.m., the initial phase was complete. I leaned back in my chair, analyzing the emotional vacancy where pain should be. The numbness was tactical advantage, allowing for clear strategic thinking unburdened by immediate emotional response. I recognized it as temporary, a psychological buffer that would eventually dissolve, revealing the raw wound beneath. I began composing 2 emails, one to my executive assistant, outlining changes to access protocols and meeting schedules, another to our corporate board, laying groundwork for the coming restructuring. Each word was measured, designed to create specific ripple effects through our professional ecosystem. The linguistic architecture of controlled demolition. Dawn began to seep through my office windows as I made the final keystroke. In a few hours, she would wake to find the first evidence of systematic response, subtle but unmistakable alterations to our shared reality. Richard would arrive at his office to find similar adjustments, each small change part of a larger pattern of strategic deconstruction. I stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of focused work. In the gradual morning light, I caught my reflection in the window, composed, almost serene. The calm was an artifice but the natural state of someone operating within familiar parameters. Crisis management, after all, had been my professional foundation. Execution phase complete, I logged in my personal notes. Commencing observation period. Upstairs, I heard movement again. She was awakening to the first day of our new reality, unaware that while she slept, I had already begun the methodical process of unraveling every thread that bound our lives together. I felt a curious anticipation, not of revenge but of systematic revelation, each carefully planned consequence unveiling itself with the precision of a well-executed business strategy. I checked my watch, 6:15 a.m. Time for a shower, fresh clothes, and the appearance of normalcy. The board meeting would begin at 9 a.m. sharp, and I intended to maintain perfect professional composure as the first tremors of change began to ripple through our carefully constructed world. 1 year. 365 days of methodical observation and calculated distance. I tracked the ripple effects of my midnight orchestration with the same precision I'd once applied to market analysis, each consequence a data point in an expanding study of systematic response to betrayal. From my new penthouse office downtown, I maintained careful surveillance of the aftermath. Professional intelligence channels provided regular updates, Richard's resignation amid mounting pressure from the board, carefully orchestrated through subtle manipulation of information flows. The systematic dismantling of his professional relationships had been a masterpiece of corporate chess, not a single overtly aggressive move, just the quiet accumulation of strategic disadvantages. My wife, now legally transformed into my ex-wife through efficiently executed proceedings, had retreated to her sister's house in Connecticut. The financial implications of our separation had unfolded exactly as planned, not devastating enough to appear vindictive, but sufficiently constraining to ensure a constant reminder of consequences. The metrics suggest successful execution, I noted in my personal log, a habit maintained through the year of transition. But beneath the analytical notation, a deeper pattern had emerged, one that defied my attempts at systematic categorization. The emptiness had evolved. Initially, I'd classified it as a tactical advantage, an emotional vacancy that enabled clear strategic thinking. But as weeks became months, the void developed its own taxonomy of absence. I found myself cataloging new categories of silence in my empty home, each one representing a different facet of loss. The morning silence, previously filled with dual routines of preparation. The evening silence, once populated by shared decompression rituals. The weekend silence, formerly structured around joint social obligations. I approached these observations with scientific detachment, documenting each variation of solitude like a researcher studying an unknown phenomenon. The process was familiar, breaking down complex emotional data into analyzable components. Yet the analysis itself began to reveal unexpected patterns. Hypothesis: strategic success does not correlate with emotional resolution, I wrote one evening, watching the city lights create patterns on my office walls. The statement felt like a confession of systematic failure, an acknowledgement that some variables remained resistant to calculated control. The professional sphere provided metrics of victory. Meridian's stock had risen 12% since the restructuring. Richard's departure had been footnoted as pursuing other opportunities, but industry circles hummed with quieter truths. His attempts to secure comparable positions met with subtle resistance, nothing overt, just a persistent pattern of doors remaining closed. Yet these achievements generated diminishing returns of satisfaction. I found myself analyzing this emotional deflation with increasing frequency. 9:47 p.m., noted successful completion of Western market expansion. 9:48 p.m., experienced expected professional satisfaction. 9:49 p.m., identified persistent underlying hollow sensation. 9:50 p.m., attempted to quantify emotional deficit. The pattern repeated across multiple success metrics, suggesting a fundamental flaw in my initial response strategy. Victory, it seemed, provided insufficient parameters for personal reconstruction. I began documenting unexpected emotional responses with the same rigor I'd applied to strategic planning. Random memory triggers in familiar restaurants. Involuntary tension upon hearing her favorite symphony. Disproportionate irritation at couples displaying public affection. Each reaction represented a failure of emotional compartmentalization, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of professional composure. I found myself creating spreadsheets of these moments, attempting to identify patterns that might yield to systematic analysis. The corporate world interpreted my increased focus on data as intensified professional dedication. Board members noted my longer hours, increased attention to detail, comprehensive strategic planning. None recognized these behaviors as symptoms of a more personal analytical obsession. Project Outcome Assessment, Phase 1 Objectives achieved, underlying structural integrity compromised, I noted at the 1-year mark. The honesty felt radical, an acknowledgement that success metrics required revision. My office overlooked the restaurant where she'd made her confession. Some evenings, I found myself tracking the flow of couples entering and exiting, each pair representing a potential unit of betrayal statistics. The analytical mind never rested, converting human interaction into data points, seeking patterns in chaos. Yet beneath the numerical facade, new questions emerged. What percentage of victory constitutes healing? How does one quantify the cost-benefit ratio of vindication versus recovery? What metrics define successful emotional reconstruction? These inquiries resisted traditional analytical frameworks, suggesting the need for methodology revision. The realization arrived with the force of market correction. I had orchestrated a masterful response to betrayal, but had failed to construct an equally robust strategy for personal resurrection. The city spread below my window, a grid of lights and shadows, each point representing countless personal narratives intersecting in patterns too complex for simple analysis. For the first time in a year, I allowed myself to observe without immediately categorizing, to experience without instant documentation. The emptiness remained, but it had evolved from tactical advantage to diagnostic tool, a measuring device for gauging the distance between strategic success and genuine recovery. Perhaps this void itself represented the next dataset requiring analysis, the next challenge demanding systematic response. I opened a new document on my laptop, titled Project Parameters, Personal Reconstruction, Phase 2. The cursor blinked with familiar patience, awaiting input. But this time, the metrics would need to accommodate variables beyond strategic calculation, a new methodology for quantifying the unquantifiable aspects of human resilience. The breakthrough came during a quarterly review of personal metrics. Between analyzing investment performance and strategic positioning, I discovered an anomaly in my behavioral data. I had begun laughing again. Not the calculated chuckle of boardroom diplomacy, but genuine, unexpected moments of mirth that defied systematic categorization. This observation warranted deeper analysis. I created a new spreadsheet titled Spontaneous Emotional Responses Longitudinal Study and began documenting these instances of unplanned authenticity. The process itself became a study in contradiction, attempting to quantify the unquantifiable, measuring the immeasurable aspects of human recovery. Subject demonstrates increasing instances of non-strategic emotional response, I noted, maintaining the clinical distance that had become both shield and prison. But even this analytical approach was evolving, taking on new dimensions of self-awareness. The penthouse, once a tactical position for observing the aftermath of systematic revenge, had begun transforming into something unexpected, a home. I found myself making non-strategic decisions about its arrangement, choosing art for aesthetic pleasure rather than calculated impact. Each personal choice represented a data point and an emerging pattern of reconstruction. During my morning routine, I caught myself humming, an unprecedented behavioral anomaly that required immediate documentation. 7:15 a.m., observed involuntary musical expression. 7:16 a.m., identified song as non-strategic emotional output. 7:17 a.m., noted absence of immediate impulse to suppress response. 7:18 a.m., allowed behavior to continue for purposes of study. The corporate world had noticed changes too, though they interpreted them through their own limited frameworks. Board members commented on my softening leadership style, unaware they were observing the side effects of personal reconstruction. Employee satisfaction metrics had improved 23% since I began allowing myself to respond to human interactions with decreased strategic calculation. My therapist, initially engaged as a tactical resource for maintaining professional stability, had become an unexpected ally in developing new analytical frameworks. She helped me create categories for experiences that defied my usual systematic approach. Joy without strategic value. Connections without tactical advantage. Moments of peace requiring no documentation. You're learning to exist without constant measurement, she observed during one session. The statement prompted a week of intense self-analysis, culminating in a revelation: the need to measure everything was itself a metric of incomplete recovery. I began experimenting with controlled spontaneity, a concept that would have seemed paradoxical months earlier. Small decisions made without extensive cost-benefit analysis. Accepting dinner invitations without background research. Allowing conversations to proceed without tactical planning. Making weekend plans without contingency protocols. Each experiment generated data, but I found myself less compelled to document every outcome. This reduction in analytical compulsion itself became a measure of progress, though the irony of quantifying my decreased need to quantify did not escape me. The empty rooms of my home gradually filled with evidence of this evolution. Books chosen for pleasure rather than professional development. Music selected for emotional resonance rather than strategic atmosphere. Even my wardrobe began showing signs of personal preference overriding calculated impression management. One evening, I found myself standing at my office window, watching the city transition from day to night. A familiar ritual, but the quality of observation had changed. Instead of analyzing traffic patterns or documenting behavioral trends, I simply experienced the moment. The revelation prompted an emergency session with my therapist. "I'm losing my analytical edge," I reported, uncertain whether this constituted progress or failure. "Or maybe you're gaining something else," she suggested. "Something that can't be measured in traditional metrics." The concept required extensive processing. I created a new document titled Non-Quantifiable Variables in Personal Recovery and began listing experiences that defied systematic analysis. The satisfaction of genuine laughter. The comfort of unplanned human connection. The peace of unstructured moments. The freedom of undocumented joy. Each item represented a departure from established protocols of emotional management, yet paradoxically contributed to a more comprehensive recovery than my original strategic approach had achieved. I found myself developing new frameworks for understanding success, metrics that accommodated both analytical precision and emotional authenticity. Professional achievements remained important, but they no longer served as the sole measure of personal value. The process of reconstruction revealed itself as more complex than the calculated destruction that preceded it. Building required a different kind of precision, one that allowed for imperfection, for the messy reality of human emotion, for the beauty of unplanned moments. In my personal logs, a new pattern of documentation emerged, one that embraced both analytical clarity and emotional truth. Subject continues to demonstrate improved integration of strategic thinking and authentic experience. Recovery metrics suggest optimal outcome requires balance between measured response and genuine engagement. Hypothesis: complete reconstruction may require partial dissolution of analytical barriers. The city lights below created their usual patterns, but I no longer felt compelled to document each configuration. Instead, I allowed myself to appreciate the random beauty of urban chaos, finding unexpected peace in the absence of complete control. A notification lit up my phone, a dinner invitation from a colleague. In the past, I would have analyzed the professional implications, calculated potential advantages, constructed response scenarios. Instead, I found myself typing a simple yes, allowing the evening to unfold without strategic planning. The moment felt significant enough to warrant documentation, but for the first time, I chose to let it exist unrecorded, unmarked except in memory. Perhaps this too was a form of data, evidence that recovery included learning when not to measure, when to allow experience to exist without analysis. In my office, the wall of monitors still displayed their usual arrays of metrics and data flows, but they no longer dominated my attention. Between the graphs and charts, life had begun to happen, unplanned, unmeasured, and somehow more complete for its lack of documentation. The meeting was scheduled with the same precision that had characterized the past 18 months of systematic response. My assistant had selected a neutral location, a private room at the Capitol Grill, carefully chosen for its optimal blend of professional atmosphere and personal distance. The time, 7 p.m., late enough to avoid the business crowd but early enough to maintain emotional equilibrium. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit unchanged by personal evolution. The maitre d' led me to the private room, where I began my pre-meeting analysis ritual. But something had shifted in the protocol. I found myself noting the room's warmth rather than its tactical advantages, appreciating the subtle lighting instead of calculating its effect on interpersonal dynamics. They arrived together, as expected. My analytical mind automatically recorded the data points, Richard's slightly loosened tie suggesting career stress, her unconscious adjustment of jewelry indicating nervous energy. But these observations now coexisted with other, less quantifiable readings, the subtle sadness in her eyes, the weight of unspoken words in the air between us. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Richard began, his corporate training evident in the careful modulation of his voice. I watched him shift into presentation mode, preparing to deliver what was undoubtedly a carefully rehearsed speech. "I'd prefer we skip the prepared statements," I interrupted, noting with detached curiosity that my voice carried neither the cold precision of strategic engagement nor the heat of emotional response. "Let's acknowledge that this meeting represents a data point in all our recovery trajectories and proceed accordingly." The corporate speak made them both flinch, a reminder of the world where I had orchestrated their professional descent. But it also provided a familiar framework for this unprecedented interaction. "You've been thorough," she said, and I detected multiple layers in her observation: acknowledgement, resignation, perhaps a trace of reluctant admiration for the systematic nature of my response. "Thoroughness was required for optimal outcome achievement," I replied, then paused, allowing myself to translate the analytical statement into emotional truth. I needed to be thorough to survive. This admission of vulnerability, carefully measured but genuine, altered the room's dynamic. I observed their reactions with both strategic awareness and newfound emotional intelligence, Richard's slight relaxation suggesting relief at human connection, her subtle lean forward indicating engagement with authenticity rather than calculation. "We've all lost," Richard said, his corporate facade cracking to reveal genuine regret. "The company, our relationships, The company is showing record growth," I interrupted, automatic defense of Meridian's metrics overriding personal context. Then, allowing my new frameworks to engage, "But yes, we've all experienced significant losses in non-quantifiable areas." The waiter arrived with water, creating a natural pause in the conversation. I used the moment to assess my internal state, applying both analytical and emotional metrics to my responses. The results surprised me. Beneath the calculated exterior, I felt peace. Not the artificial calm of strategic control, but something more organic, a genuine acceptance of complex human dynamics. "I've been tracking your career movements," I told Richard, maintaining transparency of process. "Your professional regression following strategic market adjustment has been significant." A year ago, this observation would have carried satisfa. Tie-in. Now it generated a more complex response, acknowledgement of justice served, tempered by recognition of human cost. "And I've heard you're doing well," she said, her tone suggesting multiple layers of meaning. "The company, your new life." "I've developed improved metrics for measuring success," I replied, allowing a small smile to acknowledge the evolution in my perspective. "The data now includes variables beyond strategic positioning." The conversation that followed defied my usual documentation protocols. We spoke of damage done and lessons learned, of trust destroyed and lives reconstructed. I found myself engaging in dialogue that contained both analytical clarity and emotional authenticity, an integration of processing styles that would have seemed impossible 18 months ago. "I need to know," she said as the evening drew to a close, "was it worth it? The systematic destruction, the calculated response?" The question deserved careful consideration. I reviewed the compiled data of 18 months, professional metrics, emotional indicators, personal growth measurements. The analysis revealed a complex equation of loss and gain, strategic victory, and human cost. The methodology was sound, I finally responded, but the initial success parameters were incorrectly calibrated. I achieved optimal strategic outcomes while overlooking critical variables in human experience metrics. "You've changed," she observed, and I noted the absence of judgment in her tone, just recognition of observable data. "Change was a necessary component of comprehensive recovery," I acknowledged. Though the process required significant revision of established analytical frameworks. As they prepared to leave, I felt an unexpected impulse to document the moment, to create spreadsheets analyzing the interaction's impact on all participants. Instead, I allowed myself to simply experience the complexity of human resolution, messy, incomplete, resistant to pure strategic analysis. "I wish you both well," I said, surprising myself with the genuine sentiment behind the social nicety. "Though I trust you understand I'll maintain optimal professional distance in all future interactions." They nodded, understanding the balance of forgiveness and boundary maintenance implicit in my statement. As they left, I remained at the table, allowing myself to process the evening through both analytical and emotional lenses. I opened my phone to make a final entry in my personal recovery log. Project conclusion, original objective, systematic response to betrayal, achieved with optimal strategic outcomes. Unexpected project evolution led to development of enhanced metrics incorporating non-quantifiable human elements. Final analysis suggests successful integration of analytical process and emotional authenticity represents optimal adaptation to complex life variables. End log. Close file. Begin new chapter, parameters undefined. The city lights spread out below as I left the restaurant, each point of brightness representing countless human stories of loss and recovery, betrayal and resilience. For the first time, I felt no need to analyze their patterns. Sometimes, I had learned, the data speaks for itself.